Spring of 1930, four identical baby girls entered the world in Lansing, Michigan, bringing with them a darkness that would haunt American psychiatry for nearly a century. The Morlok quadruplets became instant celebrities, but behind the angelic faces lay a house of horrors that would drive all four sisters to madness by their 24th birthday. The sealed government case files reveal a disturbing truth. For identical children, born into a seemingly loving family, was systematically destroyed by a father whose obsessions created a laboratory of psychological torture. Before we continue with the story of the Morlock family and their tragic descent into what scientists would later call dire birth, make sure to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and tell us in the comments what state you rewatching from, because this American nightmare could have happened anywhere. The warning signs were hidden in plain sight in a community that chose to look away. Lansing in 1930 was a city of manufacturing and American dreams. The Oldsmobile factory drew families like Carl and Sadie Morlock from across the Midwest. The Morlocks settled on the east side, the neighborhood of factory workers and striving immigrants. Carl Morlock had arrived in America with his German immigrant mother, Bertha, who filled his head with paranoid delusions about racial contamination and Germanic superiority, a poisonous inheritance. Bertha herself had suffered multiple nervous breakdowns and psychiatric institutionalizations. Carl worked as a laborer, his thick accent and authoritarian demeanor making him few friends. His co-workers dismissed his outbursts as the harmless eccentricities of a man struggling to fit in, but he was consumed by an obsession with protecting his family's purity. Carl met Sadie Muller in 1925. Sadie, a 22-year-old eager for escape and respectability, was drawn to his intense, old-world courtesies. Carl's attention was unwavering, though his words were few. After a short courtship, they married in a modest ceremony. In private, Carl's controlling nature emerged fully. He monitored Sadie's every activity, questioned her conversations, and established detailed rules governing her appearance and social life. Claiming these restrictions protected her from corrupting American influences, he discouraged neighbors and accompanied her everywhere, maintaining a facade of respectability in public while enforcing total control at home. When Sadie became pregnant in late 1929, Carl's reaction was complex. He craved children to carry on his name and prove his vitality, but he also feared the attention and financial burden they might bring to his carefully guarded private world. As Sadie's pregnancy progressed, her rapid weight gain confirmed the doctor's suspicion of multiple births, intensifying Carl's anxiety dramatically. In his mind, multiple births were a sign of lower breeding, more suited to livestock than to respectable German-American families. The possibility of 4 children triggered his deepest fears, inherited from his mother, about racial contamination and degeneracy. The cultural backdrop was perfect for the coming tragedy. The Great Depression made America desperate for good news and income, while the age of celebrity, led by figures like Shirley Temple, proved that talented children could become highly profitable. On the morning of May 19, 1930, Sadie Morlock went into an early, difficult labor. She was rushed to Edward W. Sparrow Hospital where, after nearly 16 hours, Dr. Henderson delivered the first infant. The contractions continued, and soon, 4 remarkably similar baby girls emerged. Each weighed just over 4 pounds, but were healthy and strong, a medical marvel, estimated at a 1 in 15 million chance. Their cries were synchronized, as if they were already communicating in ways adults could not understand. When Carl finally arrived, located after a frantic search that included local taverns, his first words echoed through the corridor, foreshadowing the family's tragic history. "What will they think, my wife is a dog?" His face was flushed with alcohol and rage. Dr. Henderson patiently explained the rarity of the birth, calling the identical girls a marvel, but Carl was consumed by fury. The idea that his neighbors would whisper about his wife producing a litter poisoned every aspect of his family's future. The babies labeled Baby A, B, C, and D were immediately the focus of overwhelming public attention. By dawn, reporters were gathering. The afternoon edition of the Lansing State Journal ran the headline, "Miracle Quadruplets, born at Sparrow." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Gifts, blankets, and cash flooded the hospital from families who could barely afford to feed themselves, but saw the birth as a blessing. The mayor of Lansing arrived, declaring May 19th Quadruplet Day. promising the Morlocks a year of rent-free housing and community support. Local businesses competed to associate with the story, offering free milk, matching outfits, and even a new Ford automobile. Carl watched this outpouring of attention not with gratitude, but with growing alarm. His private, controlled family had become public property overnight, and he could already sense the loss of control that would define the rest of his life. When a local businessman proposed exhibiting the babies at county fairs for profit, Carl's paranoia about exploitation strangely merged with his desperate need for financial security. The girls became instant public property. Even their names, Wilmer, Sarah, and Helen EWSH, after Edward W. Sparrow Hospital, were chosen through a public contest. The first 5 years established the pattern of their lives. Sodi, overwhelmed by the round-the-clock demands of 4 identical infants, surrendered control to Carl. Their modest apartment transformed into a stage where privacy became impossible. Carl appointed himself the family's manager and publicist, booking appearances and managing the constant stream of photographers. Sadi worked late into the night, sewing matching, elaborate costumes each sister, marked only by a different colored ribbon. Carl discovered his daughter's fame was a weapon. He successfully ran for local constable in 1932, using their image with the slogan, "A man who can handle 4 can handle anything." The girls' performances quickly escalated from simple picnics to elaborate, synchronized shows featuring singing, dancing, and poetry. Carl spent hours coaching them, demanding perfect coordination and identical expressions. Any deviation from his rigid script resulted in harsh, private punishment. Behind the public facade, Carl's control intensified. He installed locks on the girls' bedroom doors to protect them, monitored their conversations, and intercepted their mail. Their school experience was equally controlled. He positioned himself outside their elementary school during recess, monitoring their every interaction. Teachers who noted the girls' fear and isolation were met with Carl's hostile accusations of trying to corrupt his daughters. The family's isolation deepened as Carl's paranoia expanded. He began expressing open admiration for European political movements that emphasized racial purity, collecting German-language pamphlets promoting Nazi ideology. His bigoted comments about immigrants and African Americans grew increasingly vitriolic. By their teenage years, the performances shifted to songs. Carl wrote emphasizing feminine purity and obedience to paternal authority. He watched them from the wings, his intense gaze fixed on their faces, terrifying other observers. By 1948, when the Quadruplets turned 18, the facade began to crack. Their synchronized perfection seemed forced, and reporters noted the inconsistencies. Sarah, the most outspoken, began displaying erratic behavior, stopping mid-sentence in interviews, speaking and rambling, disconnected answers filled with references to watchers and judges. Helen, the youngest, became almost completely silent in public and drew disturbing images of faceless figures and burning houses during her brief schooling. Helen's artwork was a window into the family's terror, filled with cryptic symbols, eyes floating above doorways, children standing in cages, figures with their mouths sewn shut. The symptoms became symmetrical. Edna developed severe paranoia, convinced that reality was unstable and objects were replaced by identical substitutes, echoing Carl's own obsessions. Wilmer suffered from severe insomnia, pacing and muttering in a chaotic mix of English and German political phrases. Her nightmares were vivid horrors of being trapped in mirrors and performing for audiences with bleeding hands. Their family physician, Dr. Morrison, recognized the symptoms as nascent schizophrenia, likely triggered by prolonged stress or trauma, and attempted to intervene. Carl's reaction was explosive. He accused the doctor of being part of a conspiracy by Jewish psychiatrists and communist sympathizers to destroy his family. Carl immediately sought a new physician who would respect his normal family discipline. Carl's behavior grew bizarre, moving from domestic control to public arrest. As a constable, he spent shifts parked outside the high school, watching for degenerate influences, and began making arrests based on personal moral judgments. In 1949, social worker Helen Rodriguez began investigating reports of psychological abuse and educational neglect. Carl carefully choreographed her visits, presenting the girls as model citizens, but Rodriguez noticed the chilling details. The girls moved in perfect synchronization, finishing each other's sentences, their individual personalities subsumed into a single, controlled identity that existed only for their father. The breaking point arrived in late 1950 during a Thanksgiving performance at the Lansing Civic Center. While singing America the Beautiful, Edna suddenly stopped and began screaming that the audience was watching us die and that Father S. monsters were hiding behind their faces. The other three sisters, in a terrifying display of dissociation, continued singing in perfect harmony while Edna was led screaming from the stage. Carl's response was brutal. He confined Edna to the basement for 3 days, calling it feminine hysteria. When she emerged, she was quieter and more compliant, but further disconnected from reality. Faced with a public breakdown, Carl did not seek help. He became convinced his family was the target of psychological warfare by racial degenerates, seeking to destroy his symbol of white Christian America's racial and moral superiority. The family home became a fortress. Carl installed additional locks, heavy curtains, and began obsessively cleaning a rifle while watching the street. His surveillance became total. He installed a system of mirrors to monitor them and required them to account for every minute of their time. The girls' daily routines grew rigid and bizarre, peaking with purity inspections. Physical examinations conducted in the basement Carl called his medical facility. The abuse was escalating, becoming increasingly invasive as his obsession with their physical purity intensified. Sadi, witnessing the abuse, entered a state of profound hopelessness and severe depression. The Quadruplets, meanwhile, adapted by developing a shared delusional system. They believed they were constantly being watched and evaluated by invisible judges, who would punish any deviation from perfect obedience. The Quadruplets' private conversations, though conducted in whispers, revealed the extent of Carl's psychological damage. They referred to neighbors as watchers, teachers as corruptors, and anyone showing kindness as infiltrators sent to test their loyalty. Dr. Peterson, the less experienced physician Carl had hired, failed completely to recognize the signs of severe psychological abuse and emerging mental illness, dismissing the girls' hallucinations and catatonic silences as mere feminine iced. Despite growing community awareness, Carl's public image and position as constable made intervention difficult. He had cultivated relationships with local politicians, allowing him to easily deflect criticism. The catalyst for intervention arrived in early 1952 in the form of Dr. Benjamin Strauss, a psychiatrist and refugee from Nazi Germany. Dr. Strauss, who had witnessed the consequences of racial ideology firsthand, made a courtesy call to the Morlock home. The confrontation escalated rapidly when Dr. Strauss suggested a professional evaluation. Carl's facade crumbled, and he accused the Jewish psychiatrist of being part of an international conspiracy, declaring that Hitler should have finished the job and that America needed its own final solution. Shaken, Dr. Strauss immediately contacted state authorities, warning that delay could result in permanent damage or physical violence. The morning of April 15th, 1952, became the dividing line of the Morlock story. Dr. Margaret Collins, psychiatric social worker, and Detective Raymond Murphy arrived with a legal authority to conduct a welfare check. What they found shocked even experienced professionals. The house, normal from the outside, was an internal prison and laboratory. Furniture was sparse, arranged for clear sight lines from Carl's chair. Religious images were altered with Carl's handwriting, turning biblical verses into justifications for paternal authority and racial purity. The basement, which Carl had kept locked, revealed the true scope of his obsession. It was a surveillance and examination center. Walls were covered with hundreds of covert photographs of the girls, taken through hidden mirrors and doorways. The photographs and detailed written logs filling dozens of notebooks documented their conversations, menstrual cycles, and what Carl called behavioral anomalies and moral corruption. Dr. Collins noted the logs contained extensive references to Nazi racial theory and eugenics. With Carl attempting to analyze his daughters through the lens of genetic purity, the basement included a full medical examination table, instruments, and charts tracking purity measurements and contamination indicators. Evidence of years of increasingly invasive physical examinations. Detective Murphy discovered a locked cabinet containing Carl's correspondence with white supremacist organizations, Nazi propaganda, and detailed plans for protective measures. Upstairs, The girls' bedroom walls were covered with handwritten rules governing every aspect of their behavior, from posture to hygiene. Their clothing was stored in locked cabinets. Most disturbing were the journals found hidden beneath the mattresses, written in a cryptic code that took weeks to decipher. These journals confirmed their psychological deterioration and their shared delusion of being judged by invisible authorities. Sarah's journal, in particular, described periods of complete dissociation, watching her own life from outside her body. The decoded journals confirmed the sisters' collective breakdown. Sarah wrote about watchers and judges, blurring the line between Carl's surveillance and imaginary observers. Helen detailed violent fantasies of destroying their home and killing their father, alternating with crushing guilt. Edna documented her conviction that reality was unstable, with elaborate theories about parallel dimensions. Wilmer revealed her severe anxiety and terror of making any mistake that might draw punishment from the judges. When investigators questioned Carl, his responses confirmed his systematic fascist ideology. He openly praised Hitler's policies toward mental patients and proclaimed his belief that America needed similar programs to eliminate genetic defectives. He showed no remorse, insisting his invasive examinations were scientifically sound research into racial purity. Sodi's testimony, when questioned alone, provided crucial evidence of years of physical and psychological abuse she had endured while trying to protect her daughters. The 4 girls were immediately removed from the home. Carl's arrest on charges of child abuse, sexual assault, and endangerment marked the end of their public performance career and the beginning of their transformation into the most studied family in American psychiatric history. The collapse exposed fundamental failures in social services and law enforcement. The National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, however, saw an unprecedented opportunity. Dr. David Rosenthal, an ambitious psychiatrist, convinced his superiors that the quadruplets were a perfect natural experiment to resolve the long-standing debate on the causes of schizophrenia, genetics versus environment, with little regard for the ethical implications of using traumatized young women as research subjects. The NIMH secretly renamed them the gains derived from Greek words, meaning diabirth or dreadful gene. The girls were transported to Bethesda, Maryland, in the summer of 1952, beginning a new phase of exploitation. For the first time, they were separated from their parents and each other, housed in individual rooms that, ironically, were designed for constant monitoring, reminding them of their father's surveillance. The initial evaluations confirmed all 4 had schizophrenia, but with varying severity. Sarah was the most resilient, eventually gaining independence. Helen was the most severely affected, requiring lifelong institutionalization. Crucially, the NIM researchers failed to recognize her, deliberately ignored the central role Carl's systematic abuse and Nazi ideology had played. Their published studies focused almost exclusively on genetic factors, treating the father's extremism as an irrelevant side note, reflecting the bias of 1950s psychiatry, which often blamed mothers while minimizing paternal abuse. The NIMH research spent minimal time analyzing Carl's documented history of violence and Nazi ideological extremism. They were solely focused on proving the hereditary basis of schizophrenia. Interpreting the quadruplets, shared diagnosis is definitive evidence that mental illness was primarily biological. Their 600-page study, published in 1963, became a landmark in psychiatry, supporting theories that ignored the profound impact of trauma, abuse, and social isolation. Karel Morlok served less than 2 years in prison for his crimes, a sentence that reflected the 1950s legal system's limited understanding of psychological abuse. Upon his release in 1954, he disappeared, maintaining contact with white supremacist groups, but showing no remorse for the systematic harm he inflicted. Sadi lived quietly until her death in 1967, never publicly speaking, and maintained minimal contact with her daughters, overwhelmed by trauma and guilt. The quadruplets followed divergent, tragic paths. Sarah, the most resilient, eventually married, had children, and became an advocate for psychiatric patients' rights, speaking critically about the family's exploitation by both the media and the scientific community. Her children showed no signs of mental illness, directly contradicting the simplistic genetic theories built around her family. Edna and Wilmer spent decades moving in and out of psychiatric institutions, never fully recovering from their childhood. Helen remained institutionalized for most of her adult life, finding solace only in art therapy, which provided insights into a rich internal world that survived her severe impairment. The long-term follow-up studies continued well into the 1990s, but as understanding of trauma expanded, researchers began to re-examine the case, concluding that the mental illness might have been preventable with appropriate intervention. Today, only Sarah survives. Now, in her 90s, she has worked with authors to ensure the full story, including the racism, abuse, and systematic exploitation is finally told. She remains critical of how Nazi ideology was minimized or ignored in the original research, arguing it was central to her family's destruction. The case of the Morlock quadruplets serves as a disturbing reminder of how scientific objectivity can be used to obscure uncomfortable truths about family violence, political extremism, and institutional complicity. Their story highlights the dangers of ideological extremism and the price of ignoring abuse, even in seemingly respectable American settings. What do you think about this tragic case? How could a family as suffering be ignored for so long by a community that claimed to care about them? Could better systems have prevented this systematic abuse and exploitation? Or were the social attitudes of the era too accepting of patriarchal authority to recognize the warning signs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as disturbing as we did, make sure to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest historical mysteries. The truth about the Morlock quadruplets reminds us that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones living in plain sight, protected by respectability and scientific authority, and that the price of ignoring abuse can echo through generations. See you in the next video.